Awesome. Okay, recording started. So PACE meeting on February 7th. I think we had at least two things to talk about. And then Duncan, I think you sent a couple of extra things to the mailing list. I want to go ahead and share my screen real quick so we can get through the two things we said we were going to do. All this stuff would get out of my way. All right, so I didn't see any comments or anything on number 12 here, which is about the membership model, which is really related to the contributing file that was actually already merged. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this unless anybody objects to that at this point.
This is Duncan. I'll confess to having 900 things going on, so I'm not sure. And I know I'm the one who made that original issue, so I haven't read it lately. So do we actually address in the contributing model saying which membership model we do? Do we actually have words in there to that effect, or do we just sort of imply it?
Really not that long. So development model, fork and pull request reviewed by maintainers, discussed in working meetings, merged if approved. And then don't forget, we're going to have a separate
We don't have the, do we have the governance one done yet?
No, it's right here. It's separate from that contributor.
Yeah, I guess I would prefer to leave it open until after, because it's not clear from contributing, and hopefully it'll be clear from governance. It just, I mean, the article that's quoted in that issue is one that just says, hey, people don't join because they worry about this stuff. I just want it to be clear we're using the foundation model. It's open to all, et cetera, et cetera. That it should be sort of intuitive, obvious to people, but like even on the PGB meeting this week, it still came up that we're sort of a cabal run by certain companies. That I prefer to avoid that perception by actually having explicit things that point out that no, it's just show up and help out. You'll get a say in it too. So if we could leave it open, I would prefer that.
And you're talking about number 12, right? The repository membership model.
Well, click on it.
It's
Yeah, there you go. So there's oh, you're right. You're right. That one is I was confusing it with the other one. I apologize.
no, that's right. So I'm just clarifying. I want to make sure that we're talking about the same
It's
thing.
over in the governance stuff on the,
It's
because
this one.
it's also a membership model on this whole, foundation versus whatever. But yes, no, I'm fine with that. You can close that one. Now that we have a contributing document, again, if it needs details, we'll add more details, but that's good enough.
Cool. Awesome. I'm going to close that. And then this is the one that I expected we'd talk more about today, which is the scope of work. And I think this is about one of the emails you sent, Duncan, that I can't find at the moment for some reason. I think we are definitely more than SBOM,
Yeah, well, there's multiple dimensions to this. One is, what are the attributes that are under discussion? And there's potentially a long list. And so we sort of want to make sure the scope is, or at least I would argue, the scope is broad. I mean, SBOM happens to be something we're picking on to begin with. So was, I forget, one of the other output of one of the other tools. I don't remember what it was, but it's in all the examples on the homepage. OS Query. I mean, so OS Query, SBOM, there's a few things we're focusing on, but we're not exclusively on that. But there are some fuzzy edges to it. And so one fuzzy edge, which I think is in one of the emails I just sent, is in there's a fuzzy edge in an email I sent a long time ago and a fuzzy edge in an email from today. So we'll do the today one first. Is the asset inventory inside our scope or outside our scope? I would sort of argue that'd be outside our scope because there's plenty of existing things that do that already, and we don't need to make our life messier than we need to. But on the other side, it could be argued, no, but it's definitely part of the posture. Like, do you know what assets you have and which assets have which posture is sort of the whole crux of what we're doing. But is the actual box that on our architecture diagram that's doing the asset inventory, is that sort of inside the pace box or outside the pace box is a scope question. And SBOM, which I think is I'll call it the metadata about SBOM, the fact that an SBOM of this particular software with this particular version has these particular components, and the National Vulnerability Database CVEs that apply to it and the VEX that applies to it. I would say those are all within scope of attributes of being posture attributes. Is it the fact that this particular device 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 located in Oakton, Virginia on Duncan's desk has that software version I just mentioned on it? Is that part of PACE or part of a different box called asset inventory? Is a scope question that could go either way. We should decide it one way or the other. I would personally tend to pick it as its own box outside of PACE just to make our life easier. But again, the argument can go either way. So that's the one dimension of scope from today. And then the other dimension of scope that's at the beginning of the issue that sort of kicked off a lot of this was in a lot of the SBOM work, there has been talk about some sort of process to bless, vet, certify, 19 other words that no one can agree on the words, something about the way you've created a particular SBOM. Is this SBOM gold standard or not? And that is an aspect of security posture in my mind. But whether the aspect itself or the actual, no, we're going to do something and make something like STIX has this concept of STIX preferred, that there's a set of tests they created, a set of conformance documents they created that if someone says they meet those and they chose self-certification, if someone says, yes, I've done all this stuff, then they can put themselves on the list of being a STIX preferred, that they did STIX the way they were supposed to because they can check that box. And so this concept of a STIX preferred could be applied to many of our attributes, but in particular, because it's come up in other forums, to SBOM. So should we as PACE, as part of OCA, as part of OASIS, have something like the STIX preferred program called SBOM preferred? And we can argue should be in PACE because it is very related to posture. We could argue it's not really in PACE, but it's certainly within OCA scope, so it maybe should be its own sub-project in OCA. We could argue now it doesn't even belong in OCA, it belongs, somewhere else. And the point is, I guess for our meeting, we just care about is it inside PACE or not. But we should decide if we want to sort of get into that space or not in the PACE world. Again, I could go either way on it. I would tend to think this would be the place to do it because it is sort of what we're doing anyway, and we need some test data. And while we're getting it, why not figure out what's good test data and what's bad test data? But it could also be argued it's going to be political and going to bring in 9,000 other people and stuff like that. Maybe we don't want to do that. So those are my two sort of big. Oh, actually, I have a third. While I'm at it, I didn't put it in an email. And my third scoping question is, so there is going to be, hopefully, a plug fest in 3, 4, or 5-ish months, however far away is 2, June is 6, so 5 months. We are hoping to have a cyber automation workshop, as we've had some in the past. One would be, does PACE want to play? Hopefully they will. Do any PACE participants want to play? I can already answer yes, because I'm a PACE participant and I want to do PACE stuff at it. And as SFractal, I intend to make some open source projects that are PACE related. And so from a scoping question, the question using these as examples, we have to sort of define from the PACE project viewpoint what sort of projects belong in our repo, okay? And and all three of these projects I'm talking about are not full-blown things that some company made beforehand, like StickShifter, and said, hey, let's open source this. These are sort of, hey, let's start from scratch and everybody work together and make it. And if nobody else does anything, well, I'll make one anyway. But one of them is in PACE terminology, a PAR. So if I want to create some open source to create a posture attribute repository, this particular one that I intend to do happens to be going to be written in Elixir. It happens to be a graph database, probably Neo4j, but maybe native and maybe several other choices. Because once you're getting to graph, there's this whole issue of there's two main camps of graph, labeled property or three-letter acronym I'm forgetting. But it basically means the triad stuff. And my main purpose in creating that repo is to do the exploratory work in what is the best way to do SBOMs in a graphical database, because there's whole issues of like, particularly associated with product and version, and as multiple versions come out, what is the best way to represent it? So I'm planning on doing several of them. But all said and done, so I'm going to be doing that anyway. Might as well make it a PAR. Might as well use whatever commands we come up with to how to query it and stuff like that as its interface and make that available for the Plugfest. So if I'm going to make that open source repo, should it stay as part of Sparrow, or should that be the type of thing? And even if it's not the type of thing, what is this sort of scope and ground rules for the open source that we want to make part of the PACE project? And that's sort of an example of one of them. Another repo I'm going to make that again sort of skirts a little bit on the SBOM preferred, but let me do the not quite SBOM preferred version first, is I plan to make a repo that is just, hey, if I'm going to make this open source graph database of SBOM components and look at various ways to optimize the right way to represent it, the right schemas, the question comes up with, well, what do you use for test data? Well, it turns out there's a lot of SBOMs that exist. I mean, relative to percent of software in the world, it's a tiny percent, but there's a huge amount of software in the world. So even a really tiny percent is still a really large number. So we need to sort of make this repo of known SBOMs. And so again, I'm going to make a open source project on, hey, anybody know about anybody know anything about where any SBOMs are? Throw links in here. Is that an appropriate, again, there's going to be a Sparrow repo. Should that potentially be or an sFractal repo? Should that potentially be a PACE repo? And again, it's not quite to the SBOM preferred state. The SBOM preferred is, no, we have a set of rules about what it takes to make a preferred SBOM. This is more the grist for the mill SBOMs that we use in our test stuff. Yeah, all that stuff in the chat on graph stuff. Yeah, that's the stuff I'm going to look at. The best way to represent this pile of data in the second repo I'm now talking about and putting it in the first repo. And there's different ways to do it with different things. And I happen to have some, Elixir code and some interfaces to some existing commercial graph databases that I'm going to sort of play around with. What's the best way to do it? And just sort of, hey, what do I use for input data is the second camp. So those sort of two repos are examples of something that we're going to have to determine in our scope. Do we want no open source in this project? Do we want, hey, anybody can think of anything even closely related, we'll make it a repo in our project? Do we want some sort of criteria by which it's got to be, quote, good enough, or enough people use it, or something like that before somebody pays enough Oasis enough money or whatever before we bring it in? So the scope question is sort of around, my third scope question is around repos. Over.
Cool.
So, of course, I have my thoughts on all these, but I welcome everyone else's thoughts.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for bringing all this up. It's definitely useful. Something I did was I went and looked at, because posture attribute collection and evaluation, right? So I think one of the first things we should probably do is agree on what we mean by posture. The SACM working group had something very specific about that. It's actually here. I found it, highlighted it. We don't have to adopt it because obviously we're not SACM. And I'm sorry if it's small, but the idea here is basically, we took it from, I think it was NEA, NEA, or network, something rather. Anyway, and then we sort of added to it. So basically, it's the way we've looked at it is basically these things. So it's software, hardware inventory, configuration settings, dynamically assigned addresses, and other state information, whatever that might be, right? So this might help in answering um, some of these fuzzy edge questions, like asset inventory, like is it in or out
It
of
was
scope?
reading that prompted me to bring up the asset inventory question, because until I read that over the weekend, I
Uh,
didn't realize it was that broad, because I sort of thought of PACE as OS query, uh, various scanning tools, SBOMs. Basically, I call it metadata about assets, not the actual list of assets. But that was just because I didn't know any better, and having read only
Makes
PACE things
total
up
sense.
until
Yep.
now, I didn't know it. So I don't know what's in, I know HII and NSA are doing a lot of work in this area. What's in your guys' head?
That's a great list of things to start with. But for this particular one, the first question I had was asset inventory. Does that mean hardware or software assets? Because if you said the list of things that you've got and then the list of software that are on those things, I see as two different questions. Now, when you get to a cloud or and Docker containers and things like that, there what is the hardware asset or the virtual device that you're trying to find out what its posture is?
Yeah, so the whole definition of a device, and I do think device is probably a good word because there are some official definitions and some other standards dictionaries, and both physical and virtual. But if we do include physical device in our list, then we have to consciously decide, are we including hardware or are we only talking firmware, software? I would argue firmware is software. Some people argue it's hardware, but are we talking about things that have computer languages programmed into them? Or are we talking about, capacitors and resistors and screws and bolts? Our hardware bill of materials within scope, they're clearly within scope of the SACM work. Are they within scope of what we intend to do in this project at this time? By the way, we can also define a broad scope and say, but in the moment, we're only focusing on this narrower piece of the scope.
Yes. Yeah, and that's what Adam said after the last meeting. One of the questions is, what are we going to build first? So that's, yeah, we've got a broad potential scope, and we also need to scope what we're going to start working on.
Yeah,
But
I'm a huge fan of Agile, and I would think we'd want to focus on things that didn't already exist and need existing over things that, let's not become the place where everybody argues the best asset inventory system or the place where everybody argues the best way to do hardware bill of materials. Those are both, I consider, solved problems.
Okay.
So we would still need to interact with those solved problems, though.
Well, clearly,
And
it's just whether you put the box called asset inventory inside the paste dotted bubble on the integration
right.
bus or outside the paste dotted bubble on the integration bus. You still need it. I do not disagree.
Can I ask, are we using words like dependencies? Because definitely PACE will depend on inventory, but it doesn't mean inventory should be part of scope.
Yeah, we have to be able to interact with it, but we interact with it, or I would propose we interact with it at our boundaries, not we interact with it as we define what it is.
Yep, I think so.
At least to begin with. Maybe over time we'd change it, but I don't think any of the current participants, that's their focus. I think our focus is more in the software vulnerability realm than in the hardware vulnerability realm, or in the, yes, we have to solve the fact we don't know what crap we have realm.
So if we're going to define posture and posture attributes, then attributes have to belong to something. So the inventory of things that you can have attributes attached to, yeah, I don't think we need to figure out what kind of stuff you've got in your enterprise. That's a dependency. But then when you say, what are the attributes of that thing, then SBOM is one way of answering that, or collecting posture attributes is a, you know, a broader way of answering questions about that particular thing. So yes, determining what you own is, or what you're responsible for, is out of scope, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then about the hardware bill of materials, I would say, you know, we can consider that, but I wouldn't consider that right away. I would leave that for sometime later, like way down the road. I think right now the most important things are software, and it's just my opinion, so it's like an open discussion, right? But like software load, configurations of that software, vulnerability state, things like that.
As we said, right? So we are not considering as the assets as part of the scope, but we have a strong dependency, right? If there is a need to go figure out what is there, we need to have that interface, right? From at that level, it doesn't matter whether it's hardware or software. We get vulnerabilities on a chipset, right? So we need to know at that time. So
well,
it's the same.
the important thing is in the we that you just said. So if you look at the pictures that I sent around in some email sometime in the last few days, I drew some new pictures to replace the pictures I drew last week. And I believe the three components that we consider sort of, I think we have agreement on, at least are inside PACE, are the posture collection service, the posture attribute repository, and the posture evaluation service. Now, in the looking at it first person PACE, okay, we have to decide scope wise what if something outside of PACE. Let me word it differently. Let me go back to the IACD sensing, sense making, decision making, acting model. If the decision making needs to take some actions, needs to decide to do something, and to do something it needs input, okay, then PACE is either a sensing or a sense making box, depending sort of on which parts of it you're looking at. But PACE is the providing the input to the decision maker. Okay, so yes, the decision maker needs to know some of that, and be it be a SOAR device or some other box we're going to call the decision maker. But the things that occur to complete the big use case outside our integration bus, I think we want to not at this point define what goes on in decision making, other than we need to make some use cases, and we have to make the use cases to say, hey, for them to do their job, they need to cross the PACE boundary getting this kind of information. They need a query to do this. They need some way to put this kind of data in, some way to ask this kind of question, and some way to get this kind of data out. And if we sort of focus on that smaller piece of the puzzle, we'll avoid some of the thornier issues, which do still need to get solved. I'm just not sure they're PACE's job to solve them. Did that make sense?
No, I agree. All I was saying was that between hardware and software, they are equally the same thing, because we get issues when we get issues, we want to know both, right? Depending on where the issue is. So it shouldn't matter for us as long as we say there's a asset inventory that's accessible from the PACE system, the 3 boxes. We are good. It shouldn't matter hardware or software.
We'll have to draw out the use cases to actually define the interfaces, because I'm not even sure the PACE system would be the one that would ask about the hardware. I would think it'd be the decision making that would say, hey, what hardware we got, what software we got, what assets we got, put them together, and then go ask the PACE system, hey, I got a Raspberry Pi with Duncan's old code on it.
I agree.
Tell me about its posture.
Manager or the orchestrator, a manager, I think, in the plot diagram. Yeah, we're talking about the manager box.
Yeah.
Right. I agree.
Yeah, so we need it in the use case, and we need it defined. And if we sort of stay away from the playbooks themselves, I think we need the playbooks to define our use cases, but to actually implement the playbooks, we probably should focus on the PACE pieces parts of it first. And this gets into, well, what's the scope of PACE? Is hardware inside or outside? If we call hardware, at least for now, outside, but there's more of a need for the software, then we just, let's get that out of the way first.
When you say software, you're talking about, the inventory, kind of a thing that doesn't, the full inventory of the asset, like where I'm trying to distinguish is there a difference between the SBOM and the current set of packages installed on the software versus something that's more statically known as an asset, as part of the asset? Is there a difference, or is it not a difference?
Well, it's more a scale issue. If I have 400,000 farm bots on my farm, okay, and to keep it simple, I realize real life won't be this simple. To keep it simple, all 400,000 are on Duncan software version 1. Do we put in the PACE, inside the PACE dotted line, do we just put FarmBot Duncan version 1.1 has these 10 primary components, which these have these 100 secondary components, which have these 1,000 tertiary components, which have these whatever. I have a full complete, pretend it's really Nirvana, and I have a full complete SBOM, so I know exactly every single bit on a Duncan FarmBot version 1.1. The question is, does PACE need to know, oh, I don't have 400,000 of them anymore. I now have 399,999 because the one over in the left corner over by at this particular GPS location, just its battery just died. Is that inside PACE, or is that, no, that's over in the asset inventory. The asset inventory is keeping track of how many I got, and there's a join done by the higher plane on top of it that says, oh, just if it is a Duncan version 1.1, I get the security posture from the device, but I don't need to keep 400,000 copies of it and keep track of how they change. If, however, the software is changing, the 400,000 have 5 different versions of software, because half of them are up, 5 of them are updated, and 10 of them don't have this patch, and 16 of them don't have that. The inventory is still over in the database, but the PACE part has, well, now I don't have just Duncan version 1 anymore. I got Duncan version 0.8 and Duncan version 1.1 and whatever I need to know about all the types. I don't need to know about all the instantiations, at least in first order. And it might not work out that easy. It might be we have to combine them, but hopefully we could not have to scale the instantiation yet.
Okay, and not knowing which instance belongs to which type at any given moment is not going to be a necessity for other evaluations that are needed.
No, it'll be needed. It's just that's an asset inventory issue. The asset inventory has to know it's version 1.1, and then the PACE part needs to know, and this is what the security posture of 1.1 means.
Okay.
So in other words, we only have to do the security posture of 1.1 once, whether there's one of them or 100,000 of them.
Okay. So you're saying that everything,
as long as they're the same, right?
Well, but then if there are 12 types of it, then we need all 12 types. Yes, we need as many as there are types, not as many as there are instances of them.
In the worst case, there are 400,000 of them, right?
Worst case, but in real life, that's not really how it is. You know,
Yeah,
other
so
than laptops, which, you know, laptops are a special case of their own, but for many use cases, it's more stratified than that. And those are at least easier. So maybe we should do those first.
right. So okay, coming back to my original question was that can we not treat that kind of an inventory that has all these versions and the types and what they mean along with the hardware as well? I mean, why should we leave out the hardware? It might.
Well, are you bringing some software to the table to do that? I mean, it's also part of just, hey, what are people going to work on in the next
No,
few?
that's the interface piece. We're not going to do that, but I'm just saying when we define things, are you going to implement the asset? I'm not sure because we're saying all these are outside of this boundary, right? The 3 boxes. We're just talking about what goes into the outside. That's what I'm trying to ask. Hardware and software, from asset perspective, hardware and software should be equivalent. That's what I was trying to say.
Yes, I'm assuming that I'll propose at least to begin with that the hardware asset inventory and the software, I'll call it high level asset inventory. It's Duncan FarmBot 1.1 is part of asset inventory and it belongs in an asset inventory box, not within our scope at the moment. And that what did you mean by Duncan FarmBot 1.1? What's its SBOM? How many NVD CVEs are against it? Do you have a VEX? Have we scanned it? Whatever. All of those would be within the security posture that we'd sort of do once per type, not once per instance.
But why? Like that's where I'm lost at this point, because like what if somebody installs something new on an instance?
Then well, again, depends on your posture. If they install something new, it should be something that we already have in our PACE system, right? You know, if they go from version 1 to version
Maybe,
1.1, we should have had version 1.1 in us already. And if not, we should put it
maybe.
in. But we just don't have to put it in 100,000 times. We don't have to put it in once.
So Duncan, the boxes that you're talking about, you've got your architecture repository, and you've got the PACE component architecture and the monolithic PACE architecture.
Yep.
Those are the two most up to date that you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, great. I love the things on the left, the decision-making components that require evaluation and the components whose posture is assessed. That's a great way of splitting it up. Component is, you know, what we were calling device. That's your inventory management. So yes, I agree that keeping track of components is outside PACE's scope. And then, yeah, I agree that if you're manufacturing set-top boxes, you can manufacture 400,000 of them and there's only 3 versions. But if people have the ability to install other stuff on them, then you could get 5 or 10 or 100 different versions, and keeping track of those configurations as they affect security is part of PACE. But
right, and if we were to, which hopefully we won't on day one, try and solve the infamous laptop issue that people can put on it whatever they want, then maybe you do end up with 100,000 types for 100,000 instances. But that's at least not the problem we should solve first. And I think even in large corporate enterprises, they're trying to reduce it down from 100,000 different types to, like, you know, even though I was chief security architect of AT&T, I didn't have admin privileges on my AT&T laptop because they only allow X number of versions. X is still a pretty large number, but it's not 100,000.
Yep.
And that gets into
They still have to go out.
laptop or by
go out.
Go ahead.
Sorry, they're still going to have to go out and assess at least a subset of those, right? Like,
or maybe all of them.
I'm just saying. Version.
I mean, there's a whole Gartner report, and there's, you know, pick whichever analyst you like. asset inventory is a known thing, that there's plenty of software that already exists, open source and commercial. It's for hardware and for software at the highest level,
Agreed.
not at the full SBOM level, but at the just, we're talking
Agreed.
about, so I'm just saying, let's not put that inside our scope if we don't have to.
Agreed. I agree with that. So let me ask a question. I just, because we're running close to time, we've got a little less than 10 minutes. How would you rewrite this, anybody, for a conclusion to the fuzzy edges question, this conclusion?
I think if one is, I would attempt to avoid the word dependency, because since we will be dealing in software composition, dependency has a particular meaning that we sometimes mean it, and sometimes, as in this sentence, might mean something else. We mean dependent on as opposed to dependency. And yes, in English they're equivalent, but in software they aren't. And I would actually avoid the depending even at all, and I would say we interface with that if we're defining a system, we're trying to define what PACE is. We need to define, entity relationship diagrams, or whatever. We need to define the boundary conditions, what's sort of inside the line, what's outside the line, and most importantly, what crosses the line. So, we need to define the interfaces to PACE. And if we decide something is outside PACE, like is it our job to come up with the standard interface to asset inventory systems? I'd argue
Wouldn't
not.
that be the manager from the SACM architecture that does all this interfacing, and PACE from that perspective does not deal with it simply?
Well, but we're talking about PACE, and I'm proposing that PACE not be quite as broad as SACM was. That
Oh
the
yeah, that's
asset
what I'm saying.
inventory is outside,
Wouldn't
not inside.
Yes.
You can maybe draw the asset inventory box and the decision-making component, whatever we want to call it. I prefer not to call it SOAR, because I don't think SOAR goes far enough. But and put a dotted line around that whole system and call it SACM. But we're focusing sort of on the, hey, let's focus on these posture attributes. How do you get them, and what do you do with them?
Right. I was trying to say simply, we just say we don't do anything to do any asset inventory collection or anything like that.
Yeah.
We just don't deal with it. Simply, that's it. If at all there is any relationship, dependency, interfacing that occurs outside of the PACE boxes, right?
Yep. And we all agree it's still needed in useful use cases. It's just not our jobs. We're starting with a smaller piece, since that's a known solved piece, known sort of solved piece, but it's got problems of its own that we don't need to solve.
Is this better?
I think PACE would also not use asset information.
I agree.
Why not? No, why not? I don't understand that at all.
So
So the decision-making component, the SOAR device, whatever runs the playbook, will definitely need that information. Okay. And it will use that information, and it will use the PACE information in the use cases that make the PACE information useful. But it's not PACE doing the decision making.
Just using information doesn't imply decision making. I'm confused. I'm sorry.
Can you pop up Sparrow PACE tree arch docs arch for a second?
Can you send me a link to it? I don't understand what that means.
So I think
the email I sent earlier today.
Right. I'll try to help in between while you open up. So when we say use, that might mean that the PACE components have a direct line or a direct dependency over the asset. But what we're saying is PACE doesn't have to directly depend on it. Instead, a system above it is going to join the two. Whatever it's getting from PACE, and then whatever is getting from the asset side, it will join the two and make the decision or whatever it has to make. That's what I think we are talking.
So I'm wondering if Adam and I were having the same reaction, which is that If I'm going to go collect posture attributes, I'm going to go collect posture attributes from things. And if the asset inventory system is the element that knows, the external capability that knows what the things are, somehow Pace has got to get enough of that information and know how to find the things to collect from.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So if
Excellent point. So that's a use case that has a valid of the thing doing the query needs to know what the query. So that's valid.
How's that? Pace will rely on information originating from inventory system, and we can argue how it gets there later.
Right, because did it get there because the thing telling it to do it told it, hey, go do it on these 10 things? Or did it do it because the thing that told it said, hey, you go look up how to do it and tell me which 10 things? And we'll have to get into those level of details.
That sentence is true, but you need, I think it'd be clear after the end to say it's getting information on, to use Duncan's words, components whose posture is assessed. So the inventory system is responsible for determining which components you're assessing.
Or the higher level decision-making component is, I think of it as the brain of the whole thing is doing it, but as long as it's outside Pace, doesn't matter who's doing it, because from Pace's viewpoint, it just knows it got asked to do it and it got the information it needed.
Any better?
I think so. Can you switch to my tab for just a second? Scroll down to that picture, the first one. So the issue that we were just discussing, okay, is the posture collection service needs to go get some information. And some of the information it needs to get are in the components whose posture is assessed in the lower left-hand corner, okay? Now we've agreed it's not keeping track of who's where, but if it's going to go ask it a question, it needs to know who to ask the question of. So it gets into I think it's a detailed architectural question. We get into the issue of, does the decision making, the boxes in the upper left there that are sort of running the whole thing, they're running the playbook, okay? That has to say, hey, we need to find out if Duncan's Raspberry Pi has this bug or not. Okay, well, we can't do that if we don't know what software is in Duncan's Raspberry Pi. So the decision making says, well, to do that, I need to ask some questions. And it could ask PCS, ask component, ask PCS. It could go sort of back and forth, or it could sort of already have some of the, could ask the components, hey, what device are we talking about? Oh, Duncan's. Okay, gets the information it needs, and then it could ask the PCS, hey, what SBOM goes with Duncan's Raspberry Pi? So in the second case, the PCS just gets told what SBOM does Duncan have. So it sort of knows Duncan, and it can go ask Duncan's component on the lower left which to do. In the first case, the decision maker just says, hey, I need to know something. Go ask PCS to figure it out. And PCS asks, hey, which one is it to Duncan? So there's some sort of where you keep the information issue in how we do it. We could do it either way. I don't think we need to solve that particular one today. As long as we agree the sort of where you get the list of components from is outside our dotted line, then we can argue about, well, when we do need to know it, do we just get given it, or do we have to have the ability to ask for it? And that's a detail that we'll figure out depending on the use cases. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. We still got some remaining, we've still got some remaining things, and I actually have to close the meeting, so because I have another one coming up. But so I'll just say others remain here, and I would like kind of homework to be, maybe this is a good way to do it. So where we still have open questions. So I think hardware bombs are, well, no, I'm not going to make any qualifying statements. Where we still have open questions, can we all work to write something, or can somebody work to write something about each of these things, like proposed text, so to speak, and then we can review those ahead of the next meeting and hopefully make some more additional progress on this. I mean, I'd like to get the scope discussion wrapped up as soon as possible. I don't want to rush it, but I kind of want to get it wrapped up as soon as we can. So I think if we can work more asynchronously, that would be great.
I agree. That's good homework.
Cool.
I agree, and I'll promise to try and do it other than 5 minutes before the meeting, but I tend to not be that way, so I'll try harder.
It's a great thing. It's called reminder systems. No, I'm just kidding, Duncan. You do a lot of work, so I know you're super busy. Awesome. All right, then I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll see you all next week, but hopefully in between, get on the list and the issues, and that's it. Cool.
Okay, thanks.
Great week.
All right, take care.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.